Now, as part of efforts to boost foreign currency liquidity in the economy and strengthen foreign exchange, the federal government has concluded plans to securitize about $7 billion of the country's dividends from the Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas. While the government expects to get $7 billion from a consortium led by Standard Chartered Bank soon, the federal government is also expecting inflows from the $3 billion emergency loan from the African Export-Import Bank, which the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited secured 2 months ago, bringing total inflows expected in the short term to $10 billion. Now, according to the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Wale Edun, this would help to clear FX backlog and stabilize the naira. Joining me now is Victor Aluyi. He's Senior Vice President and Head Investments for Sankore Global. Victor, it's good to see you again.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's look at this in terms of sort of the pie that's built around NLNG. So the plan is to securitize $7 billion of dividends. And while the company is an independent incorporated joint venture, the NNPC Limited owns around 49%. We have a subsidiary of Shell owning some 25.6%, another subsidiary of Total Energies as well, 15%, and one for any international holding about 10.4%. There's also the Federal Ministry of Finance Incorporated, which also holds shares in this project. So in terms of this plan, how does it work for the other shareholders?
Essentially, it's basically the own interest that we're essentially securitizing. So being represented by the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, what interest that ministry holds in the NLNG joint venture is what the government is basically hoping to use to securitize this loan. So of course, it has absolutely no impact on the others. They will continue to get their own dividends as a point due. But we're using our own interest in terms of the portion that we have there for this securitization process. So that's what it is basically.
So in terms of the portion specifically, because there's really not a lot of detail as of now on how this is going to be done, do we know the percentage of our dividends, the dividends that belongs to the federal government of Nigeria, that's going to go into this $7 billion? Are we doing all of our dividends? Is it 50%? What are we looking at here?
So that's not clear. Like you said, the details are really not out there yet. But again, we typically get around $2 billion every year. I mean, that was much higher, but of course, with declining production, we're sitting around $2 billion thereabout. That's what we get from the NLNG. Now, whether the government is going to use all of that, some portion of it, really does remain to be seen.
So beyond that, let's also look at the fact of what the specific financial instruments may be. What are we looking to use now? Because when we look at securitizing these dividends from the NLNG, we want to know where this money is going, or where the security situation or the securitizing will be, let me put it that way. So what are the specific financial instruments or structures that we expect to be used for the securitization of these dividends?
So this is what you call a future flow securitization. So essentially, you expect monies to come in the future from a particular asset that has been performing and continues to perform. What you then do is to sort of create like a special purpose vehicle that then holds that dividend or that inflow, if you will, and then administers payments of interest and principal repayments for the loan through that special purpose vehicle. This is how we've seen it done, particularly for companies as well. But in this case, like you said earlier, we still don't have a lot of details as to how it's done. We know that the consortium of banks is being led by Standard Chartered. The other banks that are involved, we still don't know. So in terms of the details, for instance, tenor, the sort of interest that we're going to be paying on it, those are really not clear yet. But how it does work is a situation where we are creating sort of like a special purpose vehicle that will then administer through these dividends that we receive, would administer the repayment of principal and interest. It's important that, also to point out that the $7 billion would essentially come in once, and then the payments will be done over time. It's almost like, someone who's gone to borrow against their salary, right? And then as their salary comes, they basically take out of that salary to pay back the principal and interest of that loan. It's pretty much almost the same thing.
Okay, so the markets and of course investors have had a few days to take in what we've heard from the president as well as the Minister of Finance, Wale Edun, in regards to how this administration wants to handle the FX crisis. So what is the kind of interest or the response that we're starting to see, if any? And if we're not seeing any interest or even response as of yet, what are you anticipating when it comes to what potential investors or the market would think regarding the securitized dividends?
I think we've seen some impact actually, right? Not long after that announcement, we've seen the naira sort of gain some footing against the dollar, at the FX market really. So again, at the end of the day, the whole debacle around FX is basically around supply. So we've got about $10 billion coming through maybe in a matter of weeks or so. What that simply means is that there's going to be supply, and I think that the Minister of Finance has pretty much said that a substantial portion of the 7 billion is going to be used to clear that FX backlog, which has essentially been a major issue. So if that is done, you certainly would see some kind of appreciation in the naira. Recall that what we've seen so far is a situation where you had a lot of speculative activity that has pretty much driven the naira to the lows that we've seen in the recent past. So if you take out all of that speculative activity by ensuring supply, then you should see some positive move in the naira. So we've seen some move in the market. Whether that will be sustained remains to be seen. Recall that a couple of months ago, there was the announcement about the AfriExm 3 billion that we were expecting. On the back of that news, we also saw some really good appreciation. However, not much of a follow-up, and then we saw the naira basically, tilt back downwards as well. So how quickly these things are done also proved really, really crucial. The cadence and the timing, very, very crucial at this point in time.
Okay, so it's interesting you talk about AfriExm because we're going to get to that one in just a moment. But before that, are there any risks that we might be expecting or that we should potentially look out for in terms of securitizing these dividends? If there are any risk in this situation, how do we mitigate them so there's not a loss? As you're saying, it's looking like Nigeria is borrowing against its salary. So how do we mitigate the in-between time and the in-between situation before we're able to pay back, before we get into the rest of the conversation around this?
I mean, again, my analogy about the salary. So the biggest risk that salary earner has is if they lose their job, right? So they are unable to really service that load, or if for some reason their salary drops significantly. So again, it's the same thing, right? If our production then drops and we're unable to earn 2 billion a year, it could have an impact on our ability to repay and all of that. But again, if you look at where production is, I mean, this is we've hit a really low point and essentially starting to claw ourselves out of that low point. So I think that the major risk would be maybe a dent to production and also international prices, which certainly would have an impact on the sort of dividend that we receive. In the absence of those, I think that we look pretty set to take care of the situation really.
So let's talk about AfriExm now. So this securitization plan, alongside the expected inflows from the $3 billion emergency loan secured by the NNPC Limited from the bank, will all bring us to this $10 billion that the Minister of Finance has talked about. So the expectation is that all of that is going to be sorted in the next few weeks. But what we're doing, Victor, again, going back to your analogy, is getting loans and spending money we haven't yet made to fix a problem or to plug a hole. So is this really a fix that is sustainable for the long term, or are we still applying a band-aid to a situation where we still have refused to really go to the root of the issue?
I think the question really is around ensuring that we're able to paper over this situation. The truth of the matter is that you might want to think of it as a palliative measure, as one that isn't necessarily sustainable over the long term. But over the near term, we need to survive. Right. So for us to survive, these sort of measures unfortunately have to be taken. There just has to be some near-term pain for us to be able to. It's like someone that's in an accident, right? He's in an accident. You have to stop bleeding. You can't start talking about what treatment needs to be administered. Let's stop the bleeding first, and that's what we're trying to do. Once the bleeding stops, we can then obviously then start to think about the more sustainable things that we need to do from an economic standpoint, from a fiscal policy standpoint, from a trade policy standpoint. We can then start talking about that. Unfortunately, those might not be able to do anything for us to stop the hemorrhaging. And we've seen what has happened over the last couple of months, the sort of free fall that we've been on, and the attendant impact that this continues to have on the economy, on inflation, and a lot of things. So, as difficult as it might be, this might just be the best option that we need to take right now.
So this talk around midterm, short-term, long-term, and sustainable, it brings us back to the core. The majority of money or the FX that we're bringing in is remittances, and particularly with crude oil. And you've mentioned, of course, production earlier. If we're not fixing the source of the issue in terms of crude oil theft, the exits of major oil companies, infrastructural deficits around all of these conversations as well, I'm still going to come back to this. It's like we are leveraging ourselves ahead of the future. So what happens when we clear this $10 billion FX backlog? And then there's more coming up. People are, of course, getting the FX that they need. They're able to use it, but there's still demand on the market. There's still demand on the CBN. There's still demand on the government to sort this as well. And you've spent the money that has come in. Victor, I don't think many people are absolutely convinced as to how this 10 billion, I beg your pardon, is going to be spent. And then we need to, of course, start looking for more at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it's important that these long-term measures are taken into consideration. My expectation is that as we implement these short-term solutions, that the administration is obviously thinking about moves that it will take from a fiscal standpoint, from a trade policy standpoint, to ensure that this near-term solution fix, if you will, doesn't just come and go, but that we're then able to, it provides a foundation or a building block upon which the more sustainable initiatives can be taken. Initiatives around improving crude oil production. I mean, if we're able to ramp up our production with where oil prices are at, you're certainly going to see a significant improvement in our balance of payment, our balance of trade position, and that should be very, very positive for the FX situation. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of production that goes on here. We're still very, very heavily dependent on the outside of the foreign or the global economy in terms of the things that we consume here. So hence the further dollarization of our economy. So I think that as the government implements this sort of near-term measures to try and essentially stop the hemorrhaging, longer, more sustainable initiatives around fiscal policy, around trade policy, particularly with respect to crude oil production, export-led growth. Those are things that will certainly help in the long term.
So additionally, what we've also seen is that Nigeria's external reserves have experienced somewhat of a slight uptick. They've reached $33.326 billion. And this is actually the 9th consecutive day of gains. And it also helps to keep the reserves above the $33 billion mark. And that's a trend that has persisted at least since July 2023. When you look at this trend concerning the foreign reserves, what do you think we should be anticipating with the inflow coming in, and also, of course, with the continuous moves by the administration to fix the issue? Should we anticipate to see a continued upward swing when it comes to this?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is that for us to see continued accretion to reserves, production has to stay steady, and of course, as a matter of fact, even continue to rise, and we certainly would need the support from international oil prices. And international oil prices have been favorable for the last 24 months thereabout. I mean, going into the next year or so, we think that international oil prices will certainly remain stable and favorable for us. I think the key issue is us ensuring that this issue of theft is nipped in the bud. We essentially are also able to significantly ramp up our production. If we're able to do that sustainably over the next couple of months, then it creates a sustainable situation for us. So I think that everything really hinges on our ability to ramp up production in the near to the medium term.
So let's talk about the naira to the dollar. So on Thursday evening last week, the naira reached a peak exchange rate of about 1,279 naira to the US dollar. But by Friday morning when we woke up, it had settled at just around 1,113. So we've seen this rise in the appreciation of the naira's value. And many have said it's because of a lack of buyers who are willing to transact at the higher rate of around 1,300 per naira. So what do you think is possibly leading? Right now, we're at open markets. We haven't heard of any particular change in it. So we're still around that 1,113 thereabouts for the naira to the dollar this morning. But what do you think led to the appreciation of the naira on Friday, and what we could anticipate will be the trend possibly this week? Are we really seeing a lack of interest in buying at 1,300 and above?
I don't think it's a lack of interest in buying at those levels. I think it's a case of, this 10 billion that we're expecting. And what that also tells us is that there is a lot of speculative activity in that market with plenty of arbitrageurs, and you unfortunately really can't blame them, right? So the sort of move that we've seen from between Thursday and Friday is just basically on the back of the fact that there's this expectation that some supply is going to come through and take care of the demand. So people who have been speculating and hoping to buy this dollar and be able to sell higher, some panic is beginning to set in there, and that's why we're seeing the sort of retracement that we're seeing. Like I highlighted earlier, about a couple of months ago, when the whole news about AfriExm hit, we saw an appreciation, but there really wasn't any follow-up, and we saw things just go back to status quo. So the move that we've seen over the last day or two has pretty much been around the fact that there is this expectation that we will get some significant dollar supply that will take care of the backlog and take care of all of the demand that's out there. So that's the reason we're seeing that move. So it is then very important that this inflow does come in as quickly as possible to take care of the situation, because the longer it delays, the less confident people become in the system, the more widespread speculative activities even become.
Okay, since I have you with me, quickly, Victor, I want to touch on the situation around the ways and means conversation. We have a package on that coming up, but I'd like to get your thoughts, because we know that a federal high court has adjourned the hearing of a suit that wants to stop the federal government from converting its ways and means debt of about 22.7 trillion naira to a promissory note or the issuance of treasury bills and bond certificates. And we, of course, know that this is what is one of the issues that has recently ramped up Nigeria's debt profile, that money that the government has been borrowing from the CBN. But in terms of this conversion of the debt to promissory notes, or of course treasury bonds and treasury bills and bond certificates, it's nothing new. But in terms of the debt and in terms of the situation Nigeria itself finds itself, is this really the next best thing that can be done in this situation?
Well, just answering the question directly, it's probably the next best thing, right? Particularly from the government's perspective. The government is paying interest of about maybe MPR plus maybe 300 basis points on that loan as it is. So if they're able to go ahead and securitize it, you spread out that payment for 40 years at 9% per annum, you significantly reduce the debt service burden on the government. And I think that's what the government is trying to do. The law is, states what it states, right? You're not supposed to have ways and means that exceeds 5% of your previous year revenue. Even if the Senate has gone ahead to make an adjustment to about 15%, that still falls short. So I think the issues are around the legal framework for the ways and means. Ways and means are essentially, short-term lending, from the lender of last resort, which is the Apex Bank, to the government, and it's not long-term lending. Unfortunately, because of the revenue challenge and the fiscal situation we find ourselves, the CBN had then remained, a major financier of government over the last 8 years. For context, between 2007 and 2015, we had ways and means of just over 800 billion. But between 2015 and last year, we had ways and means of about 23 trillion. It tells you how much, the CBN has then become, the major funder of financier of government. And that's really not the role, of the Apex Bank. And I think that's what that lawsuit is looking at and trying to sort of address. But from a government perspective, from a debt service perspective, this is probably the best thing that the government can do now. Whether the law would be changed or whether the law would allow this to happen
is a different thing.
Really remains to be seen.
Yeah, I want to take you back to this conversation around speculators, because there are many people who believe they really are the sole reason we've seen the naira fall so much against the dollar. So how much are the activities of speculators at the naira and the dollar situation really affecting the value of the naira? Are we seeing a true, real value of demand, or is it really the speculative activity that continues to really determine how the naira is performing against the dollar?
You really can't rule out the impact of speculative activity. It's really difficult to put a number on it, but I would say that it's quite impactful. We've seen it in the sort of volatile times where there were expectations of some inflows, and you see the naira really gain. And what that just meant was the fact that there was a lot of speculative activity. If you recall, in 2017, when we had pretty much the same situation where the naira went to about 525, and then international capital market was significantly different at the time. The CBN was able to raise some money and then intervene, and things crashed back down to 360, and we stayed there for a while. So there's always, the opportunity for arbitrators to come in and speculate. Like I said earlier, you really can't blame them. You can't be pouring blood into the ocean and not expect that sharks will attack. That's the unfortunate situation we have on our hands. So yes, I would say that the active speculators has contributed to what we're seeing, and it will also contribute to maybe the quick retreat that we see, particularly if this money that we're expecting does come through quickly.
All right, Victor Aluyi, I'm going to let you go now because of time, but always is a pleasure having these conversations. And I know as we anticipate and we hear more about what's going to be coming in when we securitize the $7 billion dividend from the NLNG, we'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, fantastic. All right, so we're going to take a quick time out now. When we come back, we have international business headlines. Do stick around.